Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our final lecture in the series BES Talks. Tonight, we're thrilled to be welcoming Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens, who joins us all the way from his home in Netanya in Israel. Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens is Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department at the University of Haifa. He's also an Orthodox rabbi and an outstanding and very dynamic Jewish educator. Sam's interests span the philosophy of religion, metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. He is also the co-founder and served as the founding chair of the Association for the Philosophy of Religion. Furthermore, Sam has served as a scholar in residence in Jewish communities all over the world. He was born and raised in Leicester, and he now lives with his wife and children, and as I said before, in Netanya. Sam, absolutely thrilled to welcome you this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Sam.
To you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here, and thought I would share with you a secret message of the festival of Sukkot that's coming up. So I call this little thing the secret communist Sukkah manifesto. And there's Karl Marx with his Lulav and Etrog. The thought that I'm having here starts with the Psukim, some verses in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, Parshat Emor, and this is the Torah's description of the festival of Sukkot. And the festival of Sukkot, as we know to this day, has two main rituals that define it. There's the ritual of the Lulav and Etrog, the four species that we take and we shake in all directions, and the Sukkah, the booth that we build to live in. And the verses say, "And you shall take for yourselves on the first day of the festival the fruit of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and branches of thick trees, and willows of the brook." Those are the four species. "And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. And you shall celebrate it as a feast for the Lord 7 days in the year. It shall be an eternal statute for the generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for the 7 days of this festival. Every citizen of Israel shall dwell in booths, in order that future generations will know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I, the Lord, your God." And what I've done here on this slide is I've highlighted two little phrases. A phrase right there in the first verse, "take for yourself," and a phrase later on, "every citizen of Israel." And what you're going to see is the sages in the Talmud, they see these two phrases as marking a difference between our two main rituals of Sukkot. The four species you take for yourself, and it's going to be a very important notion, that they need to belong to you. You need to own them. You're not even allowed to borrow them. If they're not yours at the point in which you take them, you don't get the mitzvah. They need to be yours. Take for yourself. But we see later on in this passage, when it talks about the booths, it says every citizen of Israel shall dwell in the booths, which kind of has like this egalitarian ring to it. All of the citizens of Israel, they're all equal. And this leads the sages to think, you know what? We can share our Sukkot. You can't share a lulav, you can't share the four species, but you can at least, say the sages, share a Sukkah. Let's look at how they develop this thing. They are, as is often the case in Judaism, arguing with somebody who disagrees with them. Okay, and their opponent here is the great Tana, the great early rabbinic authority, Rabbi Eliezer. He says, Lulav and Etrog and Sukkah, they're just the same. He says, just as a person cannot, well, you're supposed to say it like this when you're learning Gemara together, right? Just as a person cannot fulfill his obligation on the first day of the festival, right? Just as you can't fulfill your obligation on the first day of the festival with the lulav of a friend, because it's written, and you shall take for yourself, right? It says you shall take ulekachtem lechem, you should take the four species for yourselves. Since it's written that you must take the four species for yourselves, they can't belong to a friend, they need to belong to you. So too, says Rabbi Eliezer, a person cannot fulfill his obligation in the sukkah of his friend. So if we followed Rabbi Eliezer, and miracle of miracles, it's not raining this Sukkot in Borehamwood, and a friend of yours invites you to have a meal in the Sukkah, If we followed Rabbi Eliezer, you'd have to say, no way, sorry. But just like the lulav has to be mine, the sukkah has to be mine. If I'm sitting in your sukkah, I'm not going to fulfill my obligation, right? So Rabbi Eliezer has a very different view of how the festival of Sukkot is going to look. And why is that? Because in the book of Deuteronomy, in Parshat Ra'eh, it says, Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim. You should make the festival of Sukkot for yourselves. So just like in the quote we've already read in Vayikra, it says, you shall take the lulav for yourself. In Parshat Ra'eh, it says, you shall make Sukkot for yourself. So they have to belong to you. So says Rabbi Eliezer. But the Chachamim, the sages, thankfully, they disagree. They say, no. Even though a person can't fulfill the mitzvah of lulav by borrowing it from a friend, a person can fulfill his obligation in the sukkah of his friend. Because after all, it's written, we saw it together in the earlier slide. Every citizen of Israel shall dwell in Sukkot. This is a beautiful idea. It teaches us that all of Israel are worthy of sitting in one sukkah. If only we could have a sukkah that was big enough to fit all of the citizens of Israel in it, how beautiful that would be. So yes, the lulav has to belong to you, but not the sukkah. That's what the sages say, because of all of the citizens of Israel. That's what the verse says. But then the Talmud says, hold on a minute. Rabbi Eliezer, he didn't make this out of nowhere, this demand that the sukkah has to belong to you. The verse says, you should make the festival for yourself. What do the rabbis do with that? Well, this is what the rabbis do with that. They say, what this comes to teach us in Parshat Ra'eh, you should make for yourselves a sukkah, is that you can't steal a sukkah. You can borrow one, but you can't steal one. A stolen sukkah is no good, okay? Well, we can leave the rest of that slide. It's not so important. What we learn, because we follow the sages halachically, what we learn is the following, is a summary. A lulav cannot be stolen, okay? A lulav also cannot even be borrowed. But the sukkah is different. A sukkah can't be stolen. That much it shares with a lulav, but it can be borrowed. So if Rabbi Sam invites me to his sukkah, sadly, I'm not going to be able to make it this year because it's a little bit far away, maybe another time. I can come, even though it's not my sukkah, because he'll allow me to borrow it for the purposes of the mitzvah. That's fine. Everyone with me? That's the difference between lulav and sukkah. We follow the sages. A lulav can't be borrowed, a sukkah can be borrowed, but neither of them can be stolen. Okay? So we move on. Here's the puzzle. Here's the riddle. And this is what's ultimately going to lead us to Karl Marx. What does a stolen sukkah look like? Let me give you 3 cases that all of them seem like they should count as a stolen sukkah. And what we'll see is that in the halakha, none of them count as a stolen sukkah. All of them are perfectly kosher as far as sukkah goes. Story number 1. Simon is sitting in his own sukkah, built with his own raw materials, on his own land. In barges Reuben from the street. Reuben picks Simon up by the scruff of his neck, and he forcibly evicts Simon from his own sukkah. Reuben, the squatter, sits down and enjoys a meal in Simon's sukkah. Now, there's a whole panoply of sins that Reuben has just committed here, okay? So nobody here is going to say Reuben's a good guy. Reuben is the villain of this story, without a doubt. But the question is, did he fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah? Was that, he did lots of aveiros, lots of sins, but did he fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah? Is that Sukkah a stolen Sukkah? Story number 2. Reuben sneaks into Simon's garage in the dead of night and steals all of the raw materials that Simon was going to build his sukkah from. Reuben takes those stolen materials back to his house and builds a sukkah from that stolen property on his own land. During the festival, Reuben sits down in his newly built sukkah, completely built out of stolen material, and he enjoys a meal. Again, this Reuben is a bad guy. The rabbis are not going to celebrate this Reuben. He's not going to be knighted or anything. The question is, did he fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah? Was this Sukkah a stolen Sukkah? Third story, okay? Oops, where was I? Third story. Reuben has legally acquired all the materials he needs to build a Sukkah, but he can't find a plot of land to build it on. He therefore trespasses onto Simon's land and builds the Sukkah there, much like many of the restaurants do in Golders Green when they build a Sukkah outside their front door. And it's not clear to me they've necessarily got a permit from the council to do that, right? But okay, what happens if you build a Sukkah, all of the materials belong to you, but you build it on land which isn't yours? During the festival, Reuben sits down in his newly built Sukkah, built on Simon's land without Simon's permission, enjoys his meal. Again, Reuben is doing all sorts of sins here, but does he get the mitzvah of Sukkah? Does this count as a stolen Sukkah? And I'm here to break the news to you that according to the majority of poskim, the majority of rabbinic decisors, not one of these stories of a quite obviously stolen Sukkah counts as a stolen Sukkah. And we need to understand why, okay? Let's look at the first case. Remember, Simon sitting in his own Sukkah, Reuben just chucks him out and kind of declares it his. He's a squatter in Simon's Sukkah without Simon's permission. Well, Rabbi Eliezer says that's a stolen Sukkah in the Gemara, Daf 31a, page 31a, but the sages say, no, it's not. They ask, what did he steal? Because he didn't actually move anything, apart from Simon. He picked Simon up by the scruff of his neck and threw him out the Sukkah, but he didn't actually move anything. Everything is where it always was. Nothing's been disturbed. Nothing's been moved. And the Talmud has this very strange principle called karka'a eina nigzelet, which means land is never considered a stolen item. This actually has a number of practical ramifications in Jewish law. For instance, if I was to steal Rabbi Sam's car, I don't know why I would do such a thing, but if I was to steal Rabbi Sam's car,
I'm not sure you'd want it, but anyway.
Okay, but if I were to do that, and all the while that Rabbi Sam's car is in my possession, his car has the status of a stolen good. One of the things that follows from that is Rabbi Sam is not able to sell that car to a third party, because even though it belongs to him, it's not currently under his control, because it's considered stolen. So I'm obligated to give the car back to Sam, but until I do, Rabbi Sam's hands are kind of tied. He can't sell it on to a third party because it's a stolen item. Says the Talmud, the majority of rabbis in the Talmud, land never gets called stolen. So if I was to start squatting in Rabbi Sam's house against Rabbi Sam's will, Rabbi Sam could still sell the house to a third party because land never gets considered a stolen item. Well, why not? Well, there's a verse in the book of Leviticus when God is reminding the Jewish people before they enter the land that you can sell the land of Israel, but you can only sell a leasehold, not a freehold. When you sell the land in the land of Israel, you can only sell it for up to 50 years. You can't sell it for more than that. Because the land, says God, you can't sell it into perpetuity. Ki li haaretz, because the land belongs to me. Ki geirim v'toshavim atem imadi, because you are resident aliens with me. You think you own the land? You don't really own the land. You own things, right? You own your car. You own the clothes on your back. You own the books on the bookshelves, the crockery in the dish drawers. You own all the movable items, but the land, that really belongs to God. And we own it, but all we really mean when we say we own it is we have some sort of right to use it privately, an exclusive right to use it. It's not really ours, it's God's. And because it's God's and it's not really ours, it's never really considered stolen. And therefore, in our first case, Reuben didn't steal anything. He picked Simon up and threw Simon out of the sukkah, but he didn't pick the sukkah up and move it. And the land can't be considered stolen. That actually cuts out case 1. It also cuts out case 3, when Reuben built the sukkah on Simon's land. What about case 2, where Reuben built a sukkah in his own land, but using entirely stolen goods? Well, that's also a kosher sukkah. Why? According to the letter of the law, if you're a thief, you need to give back the items that you stole. But the rabbis didn't want to make teshuvah, repentance, too difficult. So if you steal raw building material and you use that material to build something, the rabbis say, wow, it's going to be really hard to do teshuvah, because before you do teshuvah, you're going to have to knock your house down to give back all of these raw materials you use. And that's putting a very high price on teshuvah, to expect somebody to knock his house down. So what the rabbis say is, if you use stolen goods to build something, from that moment on, from the moment that you've built something with those goods, you no longer have to give those goods back. Instead, you have to give back the monetary value of those goods. So in this case, Reuben owes Simon money. But the actual raw materials, they belong to Reuben. So it's very hard to steal the sukkah. All of the cases that I came up with that look like a stolen sukkah are not a stolen sukkah. They're a very immoral sukkah, but they're kosher. Rashi was so worried about this because the sages specifically say you can't use a stolen sukkah. And Rashi saying, well, what is a stolen sukkah if none of these cases are stolen sukkahs? So Rashi comes up with the following idea. Look at this. That's a sukkah on the back of a camel. That's a sukkah that's completely movable. What does it mean to steal a sukkah? It's to actually pick a sukkah up, move it somewhere else and put it down again, not building it out of stolen raw materials, not building it on someone's land, but picking it up and moving it. So it's going to be very rare. I suppose you've seen Chabad have those movable sukkahs on the back of those vans. That would be stealable. Okay, if you stole a Chabad van with a sukkah on the back and tried to have your Sukkot lunch in that stolen van, that would be a case of a stolen sukkah. That wouldn't count as the mitzvah of sukkah. What's going on? I think Karl Marx can explain everything. Before we get to Karl Marx, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story from the Midrash. Not only can you not have a stolen sukkah, you also can't have a stolen lulav, remember? But a stolen lulav is much easier to do. It's just to take someone's lulav without their permission, right? That's a stolen lulav. The Midrash tells this really cool story. It's about a king who sends, and a highwayman, right? A man who makes all of his money by robbing people at some busy junction on the roads. So there's the king and there's a highwayman. And then the king has an official. The king's official is coming around town to tax people. He's a tax man. And the highwayman sees the tax man coming, nabs him, grabs him, and takes all of his possessions from him. He's a bit like Robin Hood. He takes the money from the rich. He just never got round to giving it to the poor. But, you know, that's what he did, this highwayman. He stole everything in the possession of the king's official. A few weeks later, this highwayman, this thief, is apprehended and he's put in prison. And the king's official wants to visit his assailant. So he goes to the prison and he visits his assailant and he says, hey, you're that dirty rascal who stole all my things. Give them back. And the highwayman sits there in jail and says, you know, I would love to give it back. I'm a reformed man. I wish I hadn't stolen from you in the first place, but I lost it all. you know, I bet it all on the horses or something, and it's all gone. Everything I stole from you is gone, apart from this mat that I'm sitting on. This mat that I'm sitting on in my jail cell, I stole this from you. And the taxman says, oh, okay, well, give that back to me then. And in return for you giving me my mat back, when you get called to the court and the king decides how he's going to punish you, and he asks you, do you have anyone who's willing to give you a good character reference? You can call on me. I'll come and say you're a reformed character, and I'll get you out of deep trouble. The very next day, the king calls the highwayman to court. And he's standing there in court, and the king says, you are a really reprehensible thief. Do you have anyone who's willing to speak up for your character? Anyone willing to be a character witness? And the highwayman says, funny you should ask that, but actually, one of my victims, your very own official, the taxman, who I initially stole from, he's willing to come and testify on my behalf. The king says, really? Well, that's quite impressive. So the king calls up the king's official to testify on behalf of the thief. And this is what he says. He says, you see that man over there? He's a dirty, thieving, no good highwayman. And how do I know that he's the guy who stole everything from me? He gave me this mat, and this mat belonged to me, and that's how I know that he's a thieving rascal. And at that point, the audience in court go, woe unto him whose defense counsel is actually a prosecutor. That's the story in the Midrash. And then the Midrash does something the Midrash likes to do. It unpacks itself for us. This is Vayikra Rabbah. It says the king is really just a metaphor for God. The highwayman is a metaphor for somebody who steals a lulav. The mat is like the stolen lulav. And if you take a stolen lulav to shul on Sukkot and you shake it, the lulav itself will cry out, and it will say, I am stolen, I am plundered. And at that point, the angels in heaven will say, woe unto him whose counsel for the defense is actually a prosecutor. And if you pay careful attention to this Midrash, and I've tried to show this in the slide, there's a character missing when you unpack the metaphor. The king stands for God. The highwayman stands for the lulav thief. The official's mat stands for the lulav. The audience in court stand for the angels. But the lulav's original owner, the victim of the crime, isn't mentioned in the end of the Midrash. Instead of the victim of the crime standing up with his mat and saying, oh, that guy's a dirty rascal, the lulav itself speaks. And the lulav says, Hamasani, Gozalani, I'm stolen, I'm plundered. Why? What's the Midrash saying? The Midrash is inserting the voice of the victim into the stolen object. Why? When a thief takes an object, all the thief sees is the monetary value. A thief, God forbid, breaks into this room. He's a silver candlestick. He sees, his eyes glaze over with money, dollar signs. He sees money. What he doesn't see is the story that's inside this candlestick, right? That these candlesticks belong to my late grandmother-in-law, right? And they have meaning to my wife and to me and to my wife's father and to my late grandmother, who probably got them from an ancestor of hers. What the thief misses is the voice of the victim inside the very object. But now we see a very, very big difference. A difference between the lulav and the sukkah. The laws of the sukkah seem to be completely dismissive of the owner's right Simon gets thrown out of his own sukkah, doesn't matter, Reuben gets the mitzvah. Simon's raw materials are stolen and Reuben builds his mitzvah, his sukkah, doesn't matter, Reuben gets the mitzvah. Reuben builds his sukkah on Simon's land without Simon's permission, doesn't matter, Reuben gets his mitzvah. It seems like the laws of sukkah really don't care about the rights of the owner of land. But the laws of lulav care deeply about the right of the owner over the lulav, so deeply that it sees the identity of the owner as bound up with the very object. It sees the story of the person in the object itself. These two things are very far apart. What's going on? In comes Karl Marx. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx responds to a criticism that many had leveled against his politics, which was like, are you crazy? No private property? Does that mean like we all have to share each other's toothbrushes? Right? And this is what he says in the Communist Manifesto in response to that critique. He says the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally. You can have property and be a communist. You're allowed your own toothbrush. You're allowed your own lulav and etrog. It's the abolition of something called bourgeois property. Bourgeois property is, to use the technical terminology, the means of production, which means you can own movable items like a telephone, although that wasn't invented yet, this tennis ball, this piece of paper, these books, those candlesticks, the lulav and etrog. You can own all of that stuff, movable items, but the land, the coal mines, the reservoirs, the things which are needed for an entire society to function, the means of production, nobody can own that stuff. That stuff needs to be shared. That stuff needs to be collected. You can own a lulav, but you can't own the land. Gosh, that sounds very much like what we've just been saying, right? Karka eino nigzelet. Land is never considered stolen because fundamentally land never really belongs to anybody. But a lulav can be stolen. In fact, Marx had a very deep appreciation of what it means to own something. The sages have this strange idea that it's called Maisa Kona B'Sheva Chakli, which means when I give some wood to a carpenter to make it into a chair, the wood belongs to me and the carpenter makes a chair. I don't just have to pay the carpenter for his or her labor. I actually have to buy the carpenter out of his newly found ownership or joint ownership of the chair. What? The idea is that by improving the raw materials and mixing his own labor into the chair, he became a partner in owning the chair. And therefore I have to buy him out of it. I have to buy back the chair, right? Buy his, buy his share of the chair, buy him out of this partnership. Marx has a very similar idea. He hated the idea, he called it alienation. That in a modern capitalistic society, you stand at a conveyor belt, screwing something in, and then it moves on, and you screw another one, and then you screw another one, and then that. And you never actually get to see the fruit of your labor, the end result. And he had this kind of idealized notion of what commerce should really look like. He says, like, imagine that instead of like being in some factory, Rabbi Sam comes to me because he wants a chair and I'm a great carpenter and I make him a chair. He gives me something in return. Each of us would have, in two ways, affirmed himself and the other person, says Karl Marx. One, in my production, I would have objectified my individuality, its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also when looking at the object at the end, when I finished making it, when looking at the object, I'd have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to be objective, visible to the senses, and hence a power beyond all doubt. There's a tremendous satisfaction a worker can get if they're not just one thing on a conveyor belt, but they actually get to see the fruit of their labor, and they get to see how their own creativity, their own industry has created something valuable. 2, when Rabbi Sam enjoys the chair, in your enjoyment, Rabbi Sam, or use of my product, I would have the direct enjoyment both of being conscious of having satisfied a human need by my work. That is, I know you need to sit down sometimes, right? And I've provided you with the means for doing that. In some way, I've objectified man's essential nature, and I've thus created an object corresponding to your need, to the need of another person. Says Karl Marx in this very beautiful phrase, our products would be so many mirrors in which we saw reflected our essential nature. When the thief steals the candlestick, he doesn't see reflected in the silver of the candlestick the story behind it. And that's why he's able to steal it in such a disrespectful and violent way. But in an ideal society, we respect ownership to such an extent that we recognize that a person's individuality and character is manifest in the things that they own. How could you dare to steal another person's lulav or etrog? But again, the land is different. From Karl Marx, this is a final slide. I was told to be under an hour. I've probably gone over anyway. But from Karl Marx to Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, it's a beautiful passage in Chorev, one of his great classic works, where Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch makes this very, in a sense, Marxist point. They were both heavily influenced by Hegel, but Rav Hirsch makes this essentially Marxist point that Sukkah and Lulav are very different. Sukkah is about our relationship to the land, and our relationship to the land is tenuous. Jewish law is not communist. I should make that very clear. I'm not a communist, and I don't think Jewish law is communist. You are allowed to buy land in Judaism and have exclusive use over it. But the rabbis are aware that even though that's the case, your relationship to the land is somewhat tenuous. You own it for 50 years and nothing more. Whereas your ownership over objects, over things that are made and crafted and harvested, that's a much deeper and more intimate relationship. And that difference is manifest in the difference between lulav and sukkah. And this is this beautiful quote from Rabbi Hirsch. The sukkah, it negates material possessions as ultimate value. You leave your house, you leave the comfort of your home, you leave that, and you go into the sukkah. That teaches you to diminish the ultimate value of material possessions. But the lulav, it links us again with our dependence upon our goods and chattels. We actually spend quite a lot of money on our lulav and etrog. There's an idea to spend quite a bit to try and find the most beautiful one you can. The sukkah teaches us not to appraise too highly our worldly goods. The lulav teaches us to value them at their true worth. The sukkah raises us above our property to God alone. The lulav teaches us to be imbued with the Spirit of God and even to exalt our possessions as God-given. The sukkah prevents us from becoming too earthly. The lulav reminds us not to soar too high above the earthly. The sukkah protects us from becoming debased by our wealth. The lulav teaches us to cherish our possessions and dedicate them to sacred purposes as the gift of God. The lesson of the sukkah is that the acquisition of goods is not the sole aim of life. The lulav teaches us to apprehend goods as instruments for our way of life before God. And so it brings us simcha, joy in living before God in a life of godliness. For if life is understood thus, it makes no difference whether you attain much or little. whether you're rich or poor. The assessment of your life lies in whether you have lived it dutifully with your much or with your little. And so the secret communist message of Sukkah, of the festival of Sukkot, is this distinction between what you might call private property and bourgeois property. Private property is the lulav and etrog. Bourgeois property is land. And by recognizing this difference, even though we're not communists, and even though Jewish law gives people exclusive use over the land that they have a holding in, the delicate balance or the counterpoint between the lulav and the sukkah in this festival is supposed to teach us a delicate balance in life, which is not to negate the material world. That's what the lulav teaches us, but also not to prize it too highly. That's what the sukkah teaches us. And hopefully, if we get the balance right, we recognize that whether we're wealthy or whether we're poor, we have lived a good life if we have used the material wealth that we, the amount of wealth that we have been blessed with to do good things, to serve God, just as we serve God with our lulav and etrog in shul this coming week. There you go. That's the secret communist message of the festival of Sukkot.
Sam, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating presentation. I'll open the floor to some questions, and if Dan and Gabriella don't mind, I'll take the first question. Yeah. So the way you compared and contrast the Abrahaminim and the Sukkah was very, very impressive. It was fascinating to listen to. Is there a similar comparison in other Jewish holidays? If yes, what are they? And if not, why would Sukkah? Why would the festival of Sukkot be unique in that regard?
I'm not, off the top of my head, I'm not aware of a similar distinction in other festivals. I think this distinction, by the way, between land and holders in Jewish law is called metaltalin, movable objects, runs very, very deep, and they're acquired in different ways. The laws of ownership are very different, but in terms of festivals, only Sukkot. So why? Great question, and I've got two potential answers, but I'm thinking off the cuff. One is because the festival of Sukkot comes at a specific time of the year. It comes at just after this major grain harvest, this major harvest. And for that reason, we're at one of the most secure points in the year, in a sense, because all of the grain for the coming year is already stored in the warehouse. It's all in the money's all in the bank. And this is specifically the point in time where we might come to say what Moshe Rabbeinu, what Moses tells us not to say. In Deuteronomy 8, in the 8th chapter of the book of Dvarim, he says, you shouldn't say that the strength of my hand and my ability made all of this great wealth. Moshe is tremendously afraid that it's specifically at this time of year, where our grain silos are overflowing, that we might forget about God in the midst of our material wealth. So there's a time in the agricultural year when we really need to kind of bang home this message, which is property's not bad. You're allowed property, but you've got to get the balance right. This would be a good point in the calendar to do that. One reason why I find that answer not 100% satisfactory is that Shavuot is also a harvest festival, and we don't have a similar distinction in Shavuot. So I'll go one step further. This is the second answer off the cuff. It's something of a mystery what point in time the festival of Sukkot is commemorating, because the other festivals, all of the other biblical festivals, commemorate a very specific historical event, a very self-contained historical event. Rosh Hashanah, the creation of the world, which happened at a particular point in time. Yom Kippur celebrates the day that the Torah, the second luchot, the second tablets of stone, came down Har Sinai, which was a sign that we had finally been forgiven for the sin of the golden calf, a very specific moment in time. Pesach is the night we left Egypt, and the seventh day of Pesach is the day we crossed the Red Sea. Shavuot is the very day that the Ten Commandments were first revealed to the Jewish people. What happened on the 15th of Tishrei? Well, nothing really. You know, Sukkot commemorates something that happened for 40 days, for 40 years. It's not a very self-contained historical. So I've heard it argued that actually what Sukkot comes to commemorate, even though it's not quite in the right point of the calendar to commemorate this, what the festival of Sukkot comes to commemorate isn't just the 40 years in the wilderness. It's the transition from having lived in the wilderness to coming to live in the land of Israel. And that's a very particular moment in time. Why should we think the festival of Sukkot is about that moment in time? Well, it's again to do with the Sukkah and the Lulav, because the Sukkah is the booths that we lived in the wilderness, but the Arba Minim are 4 species which characterize the land of Israel. So it might well be that if there's a moment in time that we're supposed to be cognizant of during the festival of Sukkot, it's that transition from the wilderness to the land. And it's particularly at that time when we become a people with a land that we have to take this message to heart. Because I'm a great Zionist. I've made Aliyah. I believe that the Jewish people have a right to be here. But Zionism, like any form of nationalism, can become chauvinistic. It can be, this land belongs to us. It's ours, yabba dabba doo. And that's not necessarily a humble or holy attitude. That's why God says, yeah, you're going into the land, but remember, Geirim v'toshavim atem imadi. You're resident aliens with me. Kili haaretz. Because this isn't really a homeland. Abraham was told to leave his homeland. The land of Israel isn't a homeland, it's a holy land. A holy land is something different. So it could be that, if you think that the festival of Sukkot marks the transition from being a nomadic wilderness people to a landed people, and again, that might be a reason why specifically Chag HaSukkot is a time we should think about this message of how do we deal with the privilege and responsibility of wealth.
Yeah, that's a great approach.
Thank you.
And it connects the dots very nicely.
Thank you.
Gabriella, you got a question?
I do. Can you hear me? I'm just listening from my phone.
Yes.
Hello, Gabriella.
Okay, hi. So I just want to ask something from right towards the beginning of the share, where you said that you can't borrow a lulav, you have to have one yourself.
Yeah.
So in the days pre-COVID, when people could share lulavim in shul, someone would go round and, in the women's section especially, and ask women if they wanted to bench lulav. But if was their tefillah not valid, their bracha not valid, if they weren't allowed to borrow it?
Well, first of all, even when we make mistakes in Judaism, even if it means that you didn't fulfill a mitzvah correctly, that doesn't mean it's invalid in all respects. It doesn't mean that God kind of, God forbid, spits on it or dislikes it, or if it turns out you lit the Hanukkah candles too early one night of Hanukkah, but it was a sincere mistake, and okay, you didn't get the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles, for example, but it's not for me to say that that wasn't a precious moment between you and God, okay? So even if the answer is that in this situation, the women who benched lulav on a lulav that they were merely borrowing, even if the answer is they didn't get the mitzvah, that doesn't mean that it was all bad. There may have been great religious value in it. But let me put it this way. It is a widespread custom to share a lulav and etrog. And it's a legitimate custom and it's halachically efficacious, but you just have to be careful how you do it. To do it right, if Rabbi Sam and I were to, so to speak, sharing a lulav and etrog, we would do it like this. I'd have my shake and I'd say, here, Rabbi Sam, I'm giving this to you. It's now yours. And Rabbi Sam would then shake it, and then he might give it back to me if he was being particularly gracious. You know, if I was worried about him, I might even say, look, Rabbi Sam, I'm giving this to you. It's yours, but only for 10 minutes. As long as such a stipulation is made, then you get the mitzvah fully. It sounds like a loophole, but if you recall, this is all a ritual, right? And rituals are about symbolizing something. So as long as you go through the rigmarole of saying, Gabriella, I give this lulav to you, it's yours, before you shake it, even though you know and I know that you know that I know that you're going to give it back to me afterwards. So basically just borrowing it, doesn't matter. The fact we've gone through that rigmarole helps to make sure that this ritual symbolizes what it's supposed to symbolize, right? Which is ulakachtem lachem. I saw Sam waving because it's true that if I don't really have the intention of giving it to you, then there wasn't a kinyan. You didn't really take possession over it. But I can really give it to you for 10 minutes.
You know, I've also heard, it's funny. I've heard in some shuls they have communal sets.
Yeah.
You know, so I've heard some people say in the past, well, if you don't have, it's better to use a communal set as opposed to using a private set, because then that's because our communal sets are set aside for that purpose. So
yes,
I don't really think there's massive. I don't really think it makes a massive difference. But I have heard that being said in the past.
I think everyone accepts that the best halachic practice is to own your own lulav and etrog. But yes, that's right, Rabbi Sam. There are different ways and means of trying to spread the lulav love. One of those ways is to have a communally owned lulav and etrog purchased for that purpose. Another tried and true way is to say, I give this to you for 10 minutes. It's not the ideal way of doing the mitzvah, but I'm sure there would be some halachic authorities who would nod you through on that one. But again, I'm not a great halachist. I teach philosophy.
Okay, thank you.
Was that at all helpful?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Dan, you got a question?
Thank you, Rabbi Taylor. Thank you, Rabbi Lebens. That's one of the most creative the Communist Manifesto I think that perhaps has ever been. So my question is a simple one. How would you translate the secret communist Sukkah manifesto and message that sits there for very young children? How would you put that across for, say, a 6-year-old?
Yeah, well, you know, what's amazing about these Jewish rituals is they're so tactile. It's not just like somebody reading the Communist Manifesto to you. It's you go out of the house and sit down in this kind of shack. It's very experiential. It's very tactile. It's physical. It's 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, if you insist. And I think that when experiencing the festival of Sukkot with young children, it's a perfect time to be talking about what does it mean to own a home? What does it mean to own a land? What does it mean for this garden to be yours? What does it mean for this house to be yours? What's important about that? And there are things that are important about it, right? We're not completely communist. We, like I said, we do allow people to have exclusive use over a plot of land. But what are the downsides of having private property? I think the Festival of Sukkot is a perfect time to be talking to young people about those who are not as secure in their property ownership. It's a perfect time to be discussing. You know, I've got young kids. My oldest is 13, our youngest is 7, and even our 7-year-old is aware there's such a thing as homelessness. And I think, you know, eating all your meals outside is a perfect time to be talking about homelessness. To celebrate the festival of Sukkot in the diaspora is a perfect time to be talking about, in what sense is a Jew at home in Britain? And there are many senses in which a Jew is at home in Britain. And in what senses is a Jew not at home in Britain? And then the question is, well, are you at home in Israel? And should you be at home in Israel? And the festival of Sukkot, I think, says, do you know what? Being at home anywhere has risks because you can become complacent. And that's the message of Ki li haaretz, the land belongs to God, not to you. You know, and yeah, these are very deep intellectual, philosophical conversations, but I think that young kids can cope with them, especially when they're prompted by something deeply experiential, like having your chicken soup in a kind of cold and rainy, dingy little hut in the garden instead of around the table. I think that creative parents are able to use those moments as a prompt for conversations that your children are ready for, you know, each to their own, you know, intellectual and emotional level. So I haven't really answered your question, but what I've suggested is to use the Sukkah and the Lulav as a prop for interesting conversations with your kids. And the best conversations with kids, by the way, I mean, I'm not an expert in parenting any more than anyone else. I can't believe they allow us to be parents without a license or training or anything. But one thing I found in parenting is the best conversations with kids are ones where you haven't planned what you're going to say to the kid. We're going to tell the kid. You've planned what you're going to ask them. And they'll often have very interesting things to say. What does it mean for them to be at home somewhere? What does it mean for them not to be at home somewhere?
Thank you.
Yeah, does that help?
Really, yeah, very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. But also to think about, you know, your relationship between things, like what things are most yours, right? I think that's an interesting thing to ask a kid. You know, I don't know what my sons or daughter would say, but I suppose they'd each pick a different toy or something, and to think about what that means for something really to be yours. What does that mean? Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Dan. Much love to your other half.
Thank you, Rabbi Lebens. I'll pass that on.
Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens, thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating session. Also, thanks everyone for the questions.
Thank you.
And it was a very worthwhile evening. We all learned lots.
My great pleasure, Rabbi Sam.
Not just a great title, but the content and everything was really, really wonderful. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Rabbi Sam. Thank you, BES.
Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Chag Sameach, and as of tomorrow, the lecture will be up on the Borum Short YouTube channel.